This is the 6th of 9 Ittf AGM video conferences. So the Finance Forum on Thursday, the 4th of November. As you can see, there are still 3 further video conferences to come in the next couple of weeks. But obviously this is the 6th one for the Finance Forum. So as part of the introduction for today, I would like to pass over to the Ittf Executive Vice President, Ms. Petra Sorling, to provide an introduction for today's webinar.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear table tennis friends. It's my pleasure today to make the introduction, and I will also go back as a background on why we have financial forums. Yes, it is part now of the video conferences in front of the AGM in Houston, but actually it was started already in 2018 during the World Championships in Halmstad, or before that. Michael Brown, our CFO, came up with the idea, why do we not have a financial forum before, to make it possible for all the delegates and attending persons at the World Championships to come to discuss and to also make questions on finances. It was a very good forum, and I think very many took the opportunity to attend. So we continued with this also in 2019 in Budapest. And as you all know, since then, we went into the digital world. So just to give that background, I like everybody to interact. We will have a Q&A session after these different parts here today. But we will also have the chance for those of you watching this seminar or webinar afterwards to touch base with myself or with Michael Brown also before the AGM. If there is anything you like to ask, please feel free. We like you to dig into the figures today together with Michael Brown, who will take you through, and also our auditor, Mr. Michael Ackerman from Mazar, is also with us today. The agenda for today will be first the 2020 financial statements, including the report, as I said, from our auditor. After that, we will go into the 2021 financial update, and we will also look what is beyond 2021. But starting with 2020 financials, of course, how to minimize the impact of the pandemic on business, its performance results, and most importantly, our staff, was for us in Ittf the highest priority, like in every organization or company. Already mid-March 2020, we started up a task force group led by our CFO, Mr. Brown. And this crosswork group met frequently, actually in the beginning every day, to give advice to the senior management, but also to us in the executive committee for us to discuss and decide. As Ittf President Thomas Weikert said at that time, there is no good solutions, there is only solutions. We had to take brave decisions, and not always pleasant ones. It included cuts in salaries and cuts in programs. But it was all done in a way to secure that we are also there in the future after the pandemic. 2020 finances is also consolidated, and the Ittf group finances is all audited by Mazars. I now will pass the floor to Michael Brown, our CFO, to give you all the details and the full financial report. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Petra. So yes, the first topic for today will be talking through the 2020 financial statements, which were also released as part of the preparation for the AGM a couple months ago now, but of course still awaiting for a formal approval of the Ittf AGM itself. So when first looking at the balance sheet side, just going through an overview here in relation to our assets and our liabilities. Just a couple comments or remarks around some of the movements or changes. For example, in 2020, you may see there is $0 in term deposits compared to the prior year, but that also results in a higher cash and cash equivalents. The main reason for that being due to the volatility of the market. Unfortunately, the banks at the moment are offering very low interest rates, almost 0%. So therefore, there's little value in locking money away for a longer term period if there's not an additional interest being earned or gained from that. In addition as well, one thing that the Ittf did look to do during the pandemic period was further investment into intangible assets, so a lot of IT related work, which I think people are starting to see a lot of the evidence of that. So you can see an increase in intangible assets. And in addition to the tangible fixed assets, the ITTF Foundation received quite a large donation of table tennis clothing and equipment from one of the manufacturers, which is then recorded as an asset until it is distributed throughout the table tennis community. When we look at the liabilities and equity side, so for example, we obviously had a decrease in our Olympic funding based on the amount of funds we released throughout the year. I will touch a little bit more on that later on in the presentation too, because it has been quite unique where what would generally be a 4-year Olympic cycle more or less turned into a 5-year Olympic cycle. But then obviously the next Olympic cycle becomes a 3-year cycle, if that makes sense. So I'll touch upon that a little bit more later. With regards to bank loans, so this is something that ITTF generally hasn't done so frequently in the past. However, through a Swiss government guarantee, it was made possible for the ITTF to receive a loan at 0% interest, as the ITTF is headquartered within Switzerland. So ITTF looked to take advantage, let's say, of that to support operational cash flow during an unknown period. And that will be payable within the next 8 years. However, we are just looking at the foreign exchange rates and until potentially interest may be charged, but at the moment there hasn't been any interest charged on that loan. And then from an overall equity perspective, you can see a decrease, which is in line with the overall loss, which I'll go through the profit and loss section of the financial statement. So in summary, no term deposits in place at the end of the year, investment into fixed assets, so very much around the technology side, the donation of table tennis equipment, as mentioned before. One thing that is quite unique based on the end of the year was we still retained US dollars 3.27 million in relation to the release of the Olympic funding following Rio 2016. So again, as mentioned, dividing that amount across 5 years or spreading it across 5 years rather than a standard 4 years. A bank loan that's guaranteed by the Swiss government. Some people may have seen various news articles or media pieces in regards to the International Olympic Committee providing loans to various international sports federations. We were one of the few who did not look to acquire a loan due to our financial standing throughout the pandemic. But however, that's something that we've been able to manage and been able to support throughout. So I think it's quite positive for us to show that we weren't requiring additional loans from third parties. And then, as mentioned before, the decrease in equity in line with the profit and loss statement. When we look at the overall financial position, so this is an example of 2019, where we can see our assets are greater than our liabilities, so a positive liquidity in that sense. And then we move into 2020 and we see a similar image or a similar situation. Our fixed assets have increased, and the increase in regards to fixed assets is as mentioned before, but overall our assets have decreased slightly during a pandemic period by roughly 1.6 million. However, that's still quite a positive strength in regards to the overall size and long-term operational ability of the ITTF. Now looking into the income statement, so we'll go through a little bit more detail of the overall income statement itself. When we look at revenue, you can see the total revenue decreased quite significantly, primarily due to the impacts of COVID-19 and the ongoing pandemic. Marketing rights was hit quite significantly without the ability to host so many events around the world, including the World Table Tennis Championships, the most significant event in terms of finances for the ITTF. Has made things a little bit more difficult to be able to manage in terms of generating revenue. Olympic funding, in the end, the release was 2.75 million, which, as mentioned before, allows a 3.27 million still available in 2021 to be released. We do see quite a significant increase in the competitions income. However, that is in relation to the new approach or the new way in which World Table Tennis does business in terms of the competitions themselves. So this is in relation primarily to the WTT event held in Macau in late 2020. There was other reductions that were or smaller reductions. For example, equipment approval fees had a modest reduction. That's in line with what was expected due to the overall impacts of the pandemic. However, during our equipment webinar, it was mentioned as well that we are slowly starting to see an uptick again in regards to the amount of equipment being approved. The ITTF Foundation had, for the first time, we drew that out of into its own line item for the income side. This also relates a little bit to the donation of equipment that was received, where we do need to, even though it was a value in kind or it was a tangible asset, as the asset is being released or being distributed, it does need to also be recognized as an income as part of the accounting policies. Our membership fees stay the same year on year. And then other income, there was a slight increase as well for a few different reasons. We have started to lease out further parts of the ITTF property within Renon in Switzerland. So there has been additional income on that side. However, it is also in relation to some of the treatment of the way in which we had to manage the intellectual property transfer of the TTX copyright from our Singapore office into our Lausanne office, which also impacts both other income as well as other expenses. When looking at our overall expenses, obviously with less competitions taking place, there was less expenses as well. So although it may look positive in some way, it also did result in less revenues as well. However, that's the primary reason for the quite significant decrease in competitions. Obviously, with less events taking place, there was less marketing expenses as well. From an administration perspective, there was a slight increase, which is in regards to a number of different items, and I'll go through in more detail. But at the end of the day, the administration and the operations of the organization more or less had to continue throughout the pandemic. However, there were certain measures put in place to help reduce the overall expenditure. High performance and development and member relations. Unfortunately, these were some of the areas we weren't able to invest as much as we would have liked throughout the year. However, there is a slight anomaly with some of those figures, and I will explain that when we go into the specific section of those areas. Governance saw quite a significant decrease. Governance primarily in relation to having a lot more meetings held virtually. So for example, the virtual AGM, as well as the various other virtual EC meetings and various other committee meetings that had to become virtual rather than the various costs that are incurred in having face-to-face meetings. The foundation saw an increase in expenses, which was a further investment into the CSR activities. It was a decision made by the ITTF to not reduce the funding in relation to the foundation's work throughout the year. So it is evident that further investment was made by the foundation. Additional expenses in relation to equipment relate to part of the setup of the T Lab that was shared as part of the equipment webinar as well. And then obviously with the Olympics and Paralympics, without the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games actually going ahead, the expenses are relatively low for 2020. So in the end, there is a results from operation of a loss of slightly over $600,000. And then when we look at our use of restricted funds and our allocation to restricted funds, so initially the use of restricted funds is from the prior year. You can see it's a slight variance of about $3,000. That's more or less in relation to foreign exchange fluctuation, as our ITTF Foundation reports in euros, whereas the ITTF reports in US dollars. And then our allocation to restricted funds, that's more or less the financial surplus that the foundation has made throughout the year, which then sits into a restricted funds and sits on the balance sheet, more or less meaning that those funds must be used for the objectives under the ITTF Foundation. So those funds can't be accessed by other organizations or other entities of the ITTF, which is in line with the requirements under the charitable status that the foundation has within Germany. As Petra mentioned, the financial statements are the financial statements of the ITTF group, so a full consolidation of the various entities that ITTF has based around the world. So ITTF being the headquarters within Switzerland is the ultimate parent company. International Table Tennis Federation Asia Pacific Limited is based in Singapore and again fully owned, so it is fully consolidated. International Table Tennis Federation North America, again fully consolidated as well. The ITTF Foundation based in Germany, and World Table Tennis Proprietary Limited based in Singapore. So breaking down a little bit further or a little bit more specific on some of the different areas, and I'll try to be a little bit quicker and just touch upon a couple of these items as I go through. But as mentioned before, on the marketing rights income, obviously a decrease across the core areas of income due to the impacts of COVID-19 and not being able to host as many international events. But as you can see there, an income in relation to the TTX project, this was part of the transfer of the intellectual property where we had to release a deferred income and recognize it as income as part of the transfer of the trademark and copyright from the Ittf Asia Pacific entity in Singapore up to the Ittf headquarters in Lausanne. Competitions income, as mentioned as well, the one that's quite unique is the other competitions line, where the World Table Tennis Macau event was managed in a very different way. So what I mean by that is there was a hosting fee paid by the organizers, but also World Table Tennis acted very much in a more or less an LOC capacity, which therefore incurred other additional expenses as well, which can be seen further on the expenses side. Obviously, there was no World Table Tennis Championships, which therefore impacts the World Title events income as well from a pure competition perspective. Whereas for all the other events, you can see a more or less a correlation to the reduction in total number of events taking place for the World Tour, for the Challenge, for para table tennis, for veterans, and so on. High performance and development. So there was a few different small pockets of income in different parts. Obviously, you can see Olympic Solidarity, quite a significant decrease in terms of dollars. Again, just the inability to be able to organize Olympic Solidarity courses throughout the year, primarily due to travel restrictions in place for the majority of the year. Equipment approval income, relatively stable, a slight reduction here or there, the main reduction being around equipment testing fees. A conscious decision was made to not look to incur or not to charge further testing fees during a pandemic period. So for example, sometimes there would be a 10-year retest of certain pieces of equipment. It was just decided to defer those testings to a period that was post the pandemic, so to help try to alleviate any additional burden that the manufacturers may face. Other income, so as mentioned, there's a slight increase with regards to rental income as well, through renting out further parts of the property of ITTF in Renon. And other income had an increase as well. There was a grant received by the Singapore government to help support during the pandemic period as well. So there was an other income element. And as you can see, what I mentioned before with regards to the term deposit interest rates, you can see the amount of interest income decreasing quite significantly. Now going through some of the expenses. So our world title events, although there was no world championships taken place, some initial payments prepaid to the potential organizers of the 2020 World Championships have been written off as expenses in a prudent measure, as well as we did have the Men's World Cup and the Women's World Cup take place as part of the restart series towards the end of the year. The World Tour, in the end, there was only 2 or 3 events that took place prior to the pandemic. So obviously quite a significant decrease in the expenses, similar to Challenge, similar to Junior Circuit, similar to para table tennis, similar to our continental competitions. A few more of those took place prior to the pandemic. However, in the second half of the year was much more difficult for those events to take place. Unfortunately, the veterans competitions couldn't take place during the year. And then in our other competitions expenses, that's where we see the expenses in relation to the WTT Macau event, as well as a couple other smaller other competitions too. From a human resources side, I'll cover that towards the end, where we've got a specific slide in relation to the overall costs incurred around human resources. For marketing expenses, obviously commissions decreased. With decreased revenue, there's decreased commissions. There were some increases in our marketing and media expenses, which was part of the initial investment or the initial upstart of World Table Tennis activities. So again, with World Table Tennis being responsible for the commercial and events part, initial investment is needed to help build out and grow a new product. So there has been some specific areas of work done in the marketing and media area. So that's where we do see an increase, which would be expected based on the introduction of a new entity focused on those areas. Implementing sponsorship had a decrease because obviously less events taking place and there was less marketing events to be held through the year. From an administration expenses point of view, from our Lausanne office, there was a decrease in overall expenses just due to less activity taking place throughout the year, but also the reduction in our office space or our footprint within Lausanne. Our headquarters in Lausanne throughout the year of 2020 only had 2 staff based there. So obviously the office rental or other office-based expenses had decreased. The Singapore office did have an increase in overall expenses, which was in relation to more or less doubling the size of the office space within Singapore. That's with the introduction of World Table Tennis as well. Our office in North America had a modest increase throughout the year, similar to our Cologne office where we have our equipment T-Lab. And the foundation office had a slight reduction, so a good effort to be able to reduce expenses during the pandemic period as well. Home office, which is one we don't normally touch on too much, but obviously with a unique situation where everyone, even if we did have an office space, was more or less working from home at some stage throughout the year, but we do provide various support. However, we are still in that transition phase where more and more of our staff are being based out of one of the offices listed above. Depreciation amortization is in line with the overall assets and our intangible assets. Chateau expenses are some expenses incurred in relation to renting out of our property. Professional services due to various contract negotiations due to force majeure or other types of terminology that was needed in relation to potential termination or potential adjustments to our various contracts that were signed well before COVID-19 happened, but obviously with COVID-19 coming into play, there was additional legal support on a few different topics here or there. So there was some increases in professional services as well. Websites, there was additional expenses made in place as well because of the investment into technology overall. So obviously the more websites that are being managed, the more expenses there'll be as well, similar with technology and software. An increase in intellectual property as further trademarks were needed to be taken out with the introduction of World Table Tennis. And then in regards to other expenses, that was part of what I mentioned earlier around the TTX. There was a requirement to write off the disposal of the asset of TTX as an intellectual property. However, the income did exceed the expenses. So it was seen from an accounting perspective as a slight profit in regards to the transfer of intellectual property from Singapore to Lausanne. With regards to high performance and development, and this was one of the areas that unfortunately we had to decide to reduce some expenditure or some investment throughout the year. So although there was quite a significant decrease, it is also good or important to know that one of the, let's say, a bit of an accounting anomaly in relation to this, and this was coming more so at the requests of the continental federations, was to look at the possibility of having funds carry over from one financial year to the next financial year in terms of development activities. And what that did result in was the Ittf at the end of 2019 carrying over roughly $300,000, which means at the beginning of 2020, we start at minus $300,000, and then we start to spend the money throughout the year, which then brings us up to a positive of $45,000. So it was roughly $340,000, let's say from a cash perspective, was spent or invested in high performance and development activities throughout the year. However, it unfortunately was one of those areas where we did have to reduce some investment into the development of table tennis. At the end of the day, there may be an impact seen a few years in advance or a few years down the road. However, for the short-term stability of ITTF, this was seen as an area to reduce some expenditure. And quite similar with some of the member relations expenses as well. Again, at the request of the different continental federations and some of the regional associations, there was a request for funds to be able to be carried over from one year to another. And again, that becomes an amount that was roughly $150,000 in the example of member relations expenses. So therefore, once we add that amount in addition to the $112,000 shown, we see roughly $250,000 was spent in this area. We will look to further review or analyze how best to manage potential carryover funds from one year to another. That's sort of some ongoing conversations we're having with some of our different partners. It does create a bit more work for accounting, and it does make things a bit more difficult to present at the moment, where some people may perceive that the ITTF reduced its spending in these areas even more significantly than what it did. However, it's the accounting treatment that needs to be taken into consideration when presenting the financial statements. When we look at governance expenses, we see a modest increase in AGM and BOD expenses. That was primarily because there was no World Table Tennis Championships. Generally, these meetings would be held in conjunction with the World Championships, so there were some additional expenses incurred. Obviously, with a quite significant reduction in travel, there was a reduction in the overall expenses incurred by the executive committee, as well as the executive committee deciding themselves not to receive some daily allowances and some other potential benefits they may receive. The ITTF president costs also decreased significantly, one element being travel, the other element being the honorarium, where the honorarium was reduced, and that was in line or similar to a number of the reductions from staff. However, you do see quite a significant overall reduction there. The various commissions and committees the ITTF has, obviously a significant reduction with less travel taking place. Similar with our working groups, not having face-to-face meetings does reduce quite significantly the expenses. And then the professional consultancy was in relation to some of the legal aspects of some of the letters received and similar towards the end of 2020, where there was legal and other fees incurred to protect the governance of the ITTF. Foundation expenses. So we can see here quite a significant increase in project spending. As mentioned before, this was one area the ITTF did not reduce its overall investment on. We did see CSR as an important area. And also the ITTF Foundation was able to generate some further income or some further funds to be able to distribute through the Table Tennis United campaign to be able to support those who were impacted quite severely throughout the pandemic. Equipment expenses, as mentioned before, some of the testing fees, and obviously an increase in regards to human resources as well by establishing more or less a team or a department within overseeing our equipment area. So that was also a key area for the increase in expenses, but also a slight increase in some of the testing fees as well, before we hopefully start to see that reduction as we look to bring more of the overall testing in-house within our T-Lab. Olympic and Paralympic Games expenses, as mentioned earlier, the decrease being that the Olympic Games did not take place themselves. So obviously the overall expenses being decreased. However, in 2021, it will be seen that there are larger expenses due to the implementation of Tokyo 2020. As mentioned before, when looking at the overall human resources side, we do see overall reductions across most of the areas. There has been a couple increases, which is just a realignment of some of the different staffing. Obviously, with the introduction of World Table Tennis being one example, in where it could be seen as there is an increase in terms of overall expenditure. But when we look at a total balance, we do see a slight decrease, roughly 7%. I know some people might think that doesn't seem like such a big decrease, considering the various reductions that were put in place throughout the year. And obviously the support or the sacrifice many of our staff made in accepting salary reductions throughout the year. However, when we do look at it as a comparison between the 2 years, it is important to take note that throughout 2019, we started the year with 55 staff. And throughout the year, we gradually grew up to roughly 80 staff. When you compare to 2020, we sat at roughly 80 staff throughout the year. So if you are doing a comparison, there was also roughly 20 additional staff added for an entire year. And then if you consider 20 additional staff and an overall reduction in expenses, you can see quite significant efforts were made to be able to save overall human resource expenditure. So what I would like to do now is pass over to our auditor, Mr. Michael Ackerman from Mazars, to provide an overview of the audit work that has taken place for 2020.
Thanks, Michael. Good morning, good afternoon, or evening, everybody. On my side, I will give you some insights on the conduct of the financial audit for the financial year 2020. This will cover the extent, progress, and conclusion of our work. It will also cover our assessment of the closing process of ITTF, and I will speak also a little bit about the significant events of the period. So if we go to the purpose of our work, so Mazars Switzerland is Ittf group auditor. So as a consequence, we are responsible to audit the consolidated financial statements of Ittf, but also we are in charge of the audit of the statutory financial statement of the headquarters. Under our responsibility, we have also the verification of the existence of the internal control implemented by management. In terms of progress of our work, so of course, as of today, our work is finalized. We issued our audit reports on July 19th, just after the financial statements were formally approved by the executive committee, management, and the finance and audit committee also. Of course, our work was finalized but much before the summer, but the signing of the report requires the signing of the formal documents by the governing bodies. If we speak a little bit about our scoping strategy, so as group auditor, Mazars Switzerland was in charge of the audit of Ittf headquarters. We also audited directly ourselves the operations of Ittf North America. The audit of Ittf Singapore office and of World Table Tennis PT was under the responsibility of Mazars Singapore, and Mazars Germany was in charge of the audit of the foundation, Ittf Foundation. Of course, we coordinate the work between our different offices, and each of them report to us based on instructions we issued. For all our audits, we issued clean opinions, especially because at the end of each audit, there was no unrecorded audit adjustment. So we were in a position to issue clean opinions. Also, we were in a position to confirm the existence of the internal control system implemented by management and formally approved by the board of directors. If we move to our assessment of the closing process, Ittf closing process, you have a comparison between our assessment in 2019 and 2020. If you could just move to the next slide, please. What we can see here is that we really have a good cooperation with management, and I really appreciate their transparency. Our assessment is also that the quality of the accounting policies and of the reporting package implemented is fully aligned with our expectation for an organization of size similar to Ittf. When referring to the standardization of the accounting plan and of the processes, we saw really a significant improvements since 2018 and the implementation of Xero. So now we are, I think, close to what we could expect, but there are still some minor adjustment or improvements to be implemented, especially to reduce the manual adjustments needed by management in the closing process. We understand that some of those improvements are really planned, but were a little bit delayed because of COVID. COVID was also the main reason, as there were some delays this year in the closing process, and especially in the consolidation process. Mostly because the audit was expected to start at the end of January, beginning of February, and as you know, it was really the beginning of the big COVID issue. What we really appreciate in the audit with Ittf is the anticipation of all key accounting matter and key topics. So we have really good discussions in advance of the closing process. And also management is really responsive when there are issues or open matters. There were some small delays, we would say, this year because they were really under the COVID pressure to find the solutions for the operations. The support we receive from them and the documentation we receive is also of very good quality. And at the end of the process, the number of audit differences identified and corrected was, we would say, very small. And this is really an improvement since the prior years. If we go now to the significant events of the year, we just reported one. As you can imagine, it is COVID-19. As you know, it became formally a pandemic in March 2020. It highly impacted the global economy, but also Ittf operations, as many competitions had to be cancelled or postponed. What we observed on our side is that Ittf took immediate measures to try to reduce as much as possible the impact of the pandemic on Ittf financial positions. So these measures included the implementation of a cost-saving plan, but also Ittf took all the administrative steps necessary to obtain financial support from the government. So Ittf obtained unemployment insurance compensation from the government in Switzerland, Germany, and Singapore. Ittf also obtained some financing from the Swiss government, and we could observe and concluded that all COVID-19 impacted were correctly reflected in Ittf financial statements for 2020. So these were really the highlights of our audit. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to ask through the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ackermann, for this very comprehensive audit report. And as you could all see, it was only yellow and green lights all over the analysis from the traffic light report. Still, there is always ways to improve. So we are very happy to see that step is taken every year. I'm personally very pleased to have the same auditor now making the audit within the Ittf group and the work together with our finance and audit committee. I will soon again pass over to our CFO for some very interesting analysis where you can see how Ittf stands financially compared to other IFs after the pandemic. Michael will also give an overview where we are in relation to our 4-year cycle. And after that, we are ready for the first Q&A session. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Petra. So I think here's a good example to be able to provide some of the measures or steps that were taken by Ittf throughout the pandemic period. So just giving an overview or an overall understanding of how the Ittf fared against some of the other international sports federations who also had difficulties throughout the year of 2020. So without naming any of the other international federations, but for example, here you could see where the Ittf fits with its roughly $700,000 loss for the year. But you can see some international federations fared much more significantly negative, unfortunately, where we can see some even exceeding 10 million plus or 20 million plus losses for the year. We do see a couple federations who also excelled throughout the year as well, but good to get an understanding when comparing to other international federations similar to the Ittf, that overall we did manage to go through the pandemic period relatively smooth, although the pandemic still has some ongoing elements. It is good to be able to have a little bit of benchmarking at the same time to understand how we compare to some of our colleagues, let's say, in terms of other international federations. When looking at a quadrennial overview, so to give an idea of how Ittf has progressed over the last three quadrennials, helps to give us a better understanding of our overall growth in the last 4 years. So for example, when we look at our income and expenses for the 4-year period of 2009 to 2012, we were sitting at roughly $40 million in income across the 4 years. And then there was an increase of around 12% for the following 4-year period, which was very much in line with the increase of funding received from the IOC, which increased from roughly $8 million to $14 million in that period. However, in 2017 and 2020, you can see quite a significant increase. It's not quite at double. Had of COVID-19 not taken place, it probably would have reached double revenue. Compared to the 4-year period. However, that's showing a very positive growth over the last 12-year period to show a significant increase for 2017 to 2020. Some commentary around that. So as mentioned before, the increase from 2009 to 2012 onto 2013 to 2016 was a 12.5% increase. And then for the following 4-year period from 2013 to 2016 onto 2017 to 2020, the revenue grew from a further 78%. However, what might be noted is in 2017 to 2020, there was an overall loss in terms of our overall equity did decrease over that 4-year period of roughly $3.49 million. However, it should be reminded that this did include a payment at the beginning of 2017 of US dollars 7.7 million. So if you were to remove that, you would already start to see a surplus. However, at the same time, we did also retain US dollars 3.27 million remaining from the Rio 2016 Olympic Games revenue share, which we are now carrying over into 2021 due to the postponement of the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games. So if you were to look into releasing or utilizing the 3.27 million, you would ultimately have a small loss or a modest loss of roughly 220,000 US dollars over a 4-year period, where the ITTF invested its largest amount of funds back into the sport through overall expenditure exceeding 82 million US dollars. So from let's say a technical or a pure finance point of view, if you were told it would only cost you $220,000 to have an additional $40 million of investment back into the sport, it's quite a good deal to be able to have in relation to the significant growth that we have seen over the 4-year period itself. So that brings a conclusion to the 2020 financial update in regards to the financial statements themselves. We have started to receive a few different questions as well as some comments too. So I will look to go through those as they are mostly operational in nature. So the first question has come from the European Table Tennis Union president, Mr. Leviton, who has asked the question, regarding 2020, how much money out of 17.6 million did ITTF allocate to continental federations? I'm not exactly sure where the 17.6 million comes from. I assume it's probably in relation to the 4-year Olympic Games revenue share coming after Rio 2016, because that was around 17.5 million. So throughout the 4-year period, we do allocate funding towards continental federations. However, it is important to also note that a lot of that funding then feeds through to our member associations. Over the 4-year period, we have invested over $10 million across the different continental/member relations projects that have helped with the overall development of table tennis. The funding that is received from the IOC is utilized for overall operations of ITTF. So it does help to support the funding of the governance, of the administration, of development, of all the different aspects. We do try to reduce or more or less use none of the funding towards commercial or event activities because we do see those as financially sustainable themselves. However, we do look to ensure we have the spread across being able to manage day-to-day operations. But of course, a large portion of that is invested back into the members and into growing table tennis in all corners of the world. A second follow-up question also from Mr. Leviton was in regards to how the revenue 3.2 million from Olympic Games was allocated. I believe this is in relation to the retained funds we still had at the end of 2020, which will now be put into 2021. So with the postponement of the Olympic Games from financial year 2020 to financial year 2021, we did retain $3.2 million to help with obviously the implementation of Tokyo 2020, but also again to support the overall governance, the overall administration, the overall development of table tennis throughout the year as well. And then the other final comment from Mr. Leviton as well was what do you mean under other competitions, revenue and expenses? So this is more a technical term in regards to accounting and finance, where if something doesn't happen on a frequent basis, we would then generally put it under a section other. So for example, in 2020, we did retain the same financial reporting structure as the previous 3 years. And with the first ever World Table Tennis event taking place, it didn't make sense for us to create a new section, World Table Tennis, for a one-off event that took place in November 2020. However, as part of the 2021 update, I will start to introduce how we will look to present our financial statements moving forward now with the introduction of the ITTF Foundation as well as World Table Tennis. And also as we gradually start to introduce the international financial reporting standards. So we do look to bring on a further and more enhanced approach into how we will present our financial statements to meet the best practices on a global basis. So that's responding to the questions in relation to Mr. Leviton from European Table Tennis Union. We also do have a couple other Q&A items that have also come up too, where we have Mr. Jaguar Robert from Uganda, who has provided some positive comments in regards to a huge thumbs up to the ITTF Finance Department and ITTF staff for such gestures as steering the ITTF smoothly through the pandemic to the extent that we did not need any loans from the IOC, to accepting to continue to serve ITTF dedicatedly with salary reductions. And number 3, some staff like CEO Steve Dainton also donating significant funds to help the ITTF Foundation. So I believe we cannot close this forum without applauding the above wonderful and noble acts. I want to suggest and also ask if ITTF can gazette some funds going forward for income generation models in different member associations to help the sustainability drive of our organization. So again, very good comments in relation to some of the feedback that was received. I have also received a further message just now as well in regards to further clarification of answers for questions 1 and 2. So I will provide or try to provide in a slightly different approach. So question 2, this is coming back from Mr. Leviton from European Table Tennis Union. Question 2 was in relation to how the revenue 3.2 million from Olympic Games was allocated. The assumption is when we mention 3.2 million, I'm assuming you're relating to the retained funds still available at the end of 2020, which is corresponding to the 3.2 million. That amount of funds has been allocated to 2021. So I will provide a bit of an update on that. And obviously that will be part of the financial statements for 2021. So that's funds still remaining available at the end of 2020. And with regards to question 1, regarding 2020, how much money out of 17.6 million did ITTF allocate to continental federations? I believe this is in relation to a total 17.6 million of Olympic funding received at the end of 2016 in relation to the Olympic Games revenue share from the IOC. And over that 4-year period, over $10 million was put towards the support of not just our continental federations, but our member associations overall. And then as mentioned as well, the remaining funds is to support the overall administration, governance, development of the sport of table tennis, so we can look to promote and grow the sport of table tennis globally. If there does need to be any further clarification, I am more than happy to have a separate conversation if necessary, or we can look to correspond via email. But in the interest of time, I will just make one final comment. We have received another comment as well, and then we'll move on to the Finance Forum update for 2021. So we did also receive a comment from Mr. Martin Chu. Well presented financials. I would like to commend ITTF for the transparency with which it manages the resources which we as member associations should emulate if we are to attract investment in our sport. So quite a good segue actually as we move into the future, because the future does also include remarks and comments around the importance of investment. So I will pass over now to Petra to provide an introduction to the 2021 update for the Finance Forum. Over to you, Petra.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thanks for all the interaction during the Q&A. And as Michael said, if there is further questions, please don't hesitate to touch base with us also after this forum. The second block now is actually the 2021 financial update and also finances beyond 2021. 2021, with the pandemic still affecting us, is of course very difficult to handle with a lot of changes and agility throughout the year. We do see the need for external investment, as was just mentioned, and we also see it's a very difficult landscape to work in. Difficult for companies to take decisions in regards to sponsorship, but also we can see difficulties to know how much contribution we will have also from the IOC in the future to come. We saw recently also during the ANOC conference how their budget was cut. So it is unpredictable, and therefore we also need to take a prudent approach in everything what we are doing. During the year, we also worked on the reporting following the IFRS and risk management control. Michael will tell you more about it. And I will now leave the floor again to you, Michael, for a full report. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. So with regards to 2021, obviously we're moving towards the end of the year. However, there are still some areas we are trying to finalize of how the total financial picture of 2021 will look. And obviously with the World Table Tennis Championships taking place in a couple of weeks' time as well. So in late 2020, to give a timeline or an overview of 2021 activities, in late 2020, there was an announcement for 3 series of events to take place prior to the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games, a Middle East hub, a China hub, and a Europe hub. Unfortunately, only one of these eventuated, and obviously we needed to go back to the drawing board and understand how the overall finances may look with still a reduction of overall events taking place throughout the year. In April 2021, it was decided to host no more events prior to the postponed Tokyo Olympic Games to reduce the potential risks of players contracting COVID-19 if they were traveling extensively, but to also allow a dedicated preparation for the Olympic Games themselves. So again, this was not allowing Ittf to be able to generate revenues. However, in the best interest of the sport and to allow the athletes to prepare, it was decided to reduce or to not have any events during that period, which ultimately impacts overall revenue. But that was a conscious decision made. In June 2021, the World Table Tennis Championships were confirmed to take place in Houston, USA. So again, it was a bit of uncertainty in the first half of the year of will or won't the World Table Tennis Championships take place. Originally, they were due to take place this year in the month of June. However, with the postponement of the Olympic Games, it was quite tough to have a World Championships and Olympic Games just 1 month apart. So it has been exciting to see that the World Championships can take place in November this year. Further events also took place in the third quarter in WTT Star Contender and Contender events, taking place throughout Africa, Asia, and Europe as well, due to recommence following the Olympic Games. Throughout the year, High Performance and Development have continued to implement their revised activities, generally focused around online courses and activities. So again, trying to take the opportunity to promote and develop table tennis into the household or the table tennis club locally, even if it has been difficult for some people to travel on an international scale. Staffing has remained relatively stable throughout the year. We have advertised various positions, but not always hired for those positions. Again, it's one of those catch-22 that if and when the borders open and free travel becomes much easier, we need to be ready to hit the ground running. We need to have sufficient resources in place. However, if the borders don't open, we're not able to hit the ground running. We also don't want to have an excess number of staff that unfortunately we will be paying without being able to implement the jobs they're being hired for. So it has been a little bit play it by ear in a way, but we have been trying to be as methodical and as agile as possible, as Petra mentioned, the importance of agility during the unknown period in 2021 as well. As I alluded to before, and we also mentioned during the finance forum last year, with regards to reporting standards. So we are looking to enhance or increase our financial reporting standards. So at the moment, we currently follow Switzerland generally accepted accounting principles for our consolidated financial statements, as well as our ITTF Lausanne entity. Our subsidiaries based in Singapore follow the Singapore International Financial Reporting Standards, which do have some differences. They're not major, but there are some differences in how reporting needs to take place. And then when we do consolidate those financial statements into our Swiss-based consolidated statements, we do need to make a number of different adjustments and changes as well. I think the other key part there is to understand how, again, benchmarking or comparing to some other international federations, there are a number of sports, including the IOC as well, who have started to adopt the international financial reporting standards. And that's something that we will be looking, or we have been working on already, but looking to implement over the next 2 to 3 years, because it is something that does not take place overnight, because we also need to provide historical comparisons. So it makes sense for us to work in parallel, as in to gradually start to build up our reporting standards to meet international financial reporting standards, which will then allow us in 2 or 3 years' time, once we've got our history, to be able to present officially or formally the new reporting standards. When looking at our overall 2021 finances, and this is what I mentioned before of how we look to reallocate how we present our financial statements based on the different financial statement line items, which is also in line with how a number of international sports federations also present their financial statements, those who are following the international reporting standards. So we have our revenue. We see a slight increase in 2021 compared to 2020. Obviously, the amount of funding through the Olympic Games revenue share will increase with the Tokyo Games taking place compared to the postponement from the year prior. Obviously, our affiliation fees remain the same. However, there will be the potential to have an additional member confirmed during the AGM upcoming. And then our other income is what falls in regards to non-event related income primarily. So we do see total income hopefully exceeding $20 million again. It is still a little bit unknown based on the overall situation of COVID-19. And as I think everyone's come to be aware over the last 18 months or so, that things do change. Hopefully they're changing more for the positive now, but we do need to be mindful that some things may or may not happen in the last couple months of the year. When we look at our expenses, we do see our event expenses. So again, an increase, obviously more events taking place in 2021, the World Table Tennis Championships, as well as the introduction of a number of World Table Tennis events as well. Our project expenses, that's what incorporates high performance and development, as well as member relations, as well as our foundation. Our equipment expenses is in relation to generating our revenue that's equipment related, and that fits in our overall revenue bucket above, because at the end of the day, without the equipment approval, the equipment can't be used at our events. Member relations is specific in relation to the governance grants that have been introduced as part of the new 4-year cycle of funding support provided to the various continental federations, and obviously the member associations too. Overall governance for ITTF, so in relation to our executive committee, our elected officials, our committees, our commissions, and so on, we do see a slight increase as well, with increased travel happening throughout the year. And then our overall general and administrative expenses, we do see an increase, obviously, with regards to overall salaries this year. We haven't had to make full reductions throughout the year, or any reductions from a large scale. But obviously there are other general and administrative expenses, such as office expenses and similar. That brings our total expenses to slightly over $25 million US, which does show a negative balance of roughly 4.4 million. This is in relation to investment into the starting of one major aspect is World Table Tennis, but also the overall growth and investment into table tennis. And that's, as mentioned a couple of times already, is the importance of looking to have external investment to help cover these initial losses. In addition to that, as part of the overall reporting, and this has been a pilot project or a trial run specifically with regards to World Table Tennis finances, as part of the master license agreement between ITTF and World Table Tennis, it is required for World Table Tennis to present a quarterly management information pack to the executive committee of the ITTF. And this includes a detailed profit and loss, a detailed balance sheet, intercompany balances and transactions, bank reconciliation summaries, age receivable summaries, prepayment schedules, loan receivables, fixed asset register, age payable summary, advance billing schedule, loan payables, and share capital. And that's a report that's provided on a quarterly basis to the executive committee, which details roughly 40 to 50 pages of detailed financial information. As a pilot project, we then looked to implement that across the various entities of Ittf. However, it was much easier to start with a new organization or a new company to provide detailed reporting on a more systematic basis. However, now that we've been able to solidify that approach, we'll now look to replicate that across the various other organizations of the Ittf group, again, reporting into the Ittf executive committee. So in summary, presented in the 2020 Ittf AGM, the forecasted loss for 2021 was actually expected to reach close to US $10 million. So the figure presented above was slightly over 4 million. So we have been able to reduce some of the expenditure, which also links in relation to the ongoing impacts of COVID-19. As mentioned, for example, in the second quarter, there was no events taking place, which obviously reduces the amount of revenue, which therefore forces or ensures that we reduce our expenses as well. The release of Olympic funds may still adjust dependent upon the final payments due from the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games revenue share, and I will speak a little bit more about that towards the end of the presentation. In addition, our expenditure related to development and member relations will also see what can take place in the coming months as we start to see borders opening and more, let's say, freedom for activities to take place. When looking at beyond 2021, so looking into 2022 and the future. So this was the balances presented last year when we looked at a 4-year forecast of how we would see initial losses in the coming 4-year period, therefore looking to seek external investment to help cover those losses. When we look at how we've revised those figures for 2021, we do see quite a significant decrease. We have looked at in ways in which we can become more robust, ways in which we can look to be more economies of scale in terms of saving of expenses. Although there still is seen as a loss over the next 4-year period, we have been able to reduce it initially to help lift the burden that could be seen initially without external investment. However, it does, you can see the trend does become around the external investment aspect. And then when we do look at the revenue growth or the potential or expected revenue growth, you can see why we're looking to go down this path. We had revenue during 2020, during a COVID year of roughly $15 million. We're forecasting to hopefully exceed $20 million in 2021. And then assuming we can have, if not a full calendar, but near a full calendar of events from 2022, we can see that amount more or less triple. So with the support of external investment, at the end of the day, the common saying of you need to spend money to make money, but we need to have external investment to help us be able to spend that money to therefore help us generate greater revenues moving forward, which ultimately allows us to then invest back into the development and growth of table tennis. So negative balance, it is an important part, and I know it's something that could be concerning to some people to understand why we look to forecast continuous negative balances. But it does give a picture of 21 to 24. However, now with the Tokyo Olympic Games taking place and the subsequent revenue share we will receive, it does have little disruption in terms of short-term cash flow. However, it does mean that we do need to solve additional external investment for the growth envisioned for world table tennis. The investment will be targeted towards one of the most important areas is increasing the prize money for our athletes. We are still one of the lower prize money sports in the world when it comes to the professional aspect. So investing back into the players is key as they are at the core of the sport. To enhance our TV production, which is an initial investment, which will then hopefully result in greater revenues from media rights further down the track. However, we need to have a proof of concept to show that improved TV production will improve the viewer's experience on TV. In addition, we would also look to invest into the overall event experience, making it more than just a table tennis tournament, but more of an experience for fans to be able to attend the events. So without the external investment, these improvements would not be possible. Unfortunately, it would mean we can't increase the prize money. It means we can't enhance the TV production and so on. which therefore hinders or makes it more difficult for us to generate the additional revenues, which would then allow us to reinvest back into the sport. And finally, the external investment also helps to reduce the overall risk in terms of the ITTF's finances. So it's important to understand the risk management aspect as well. In regards to WTT investment, originally prior to COVID-19, there was a confirmation in regards to external investment. However, that did not materialize in the end. And throughout the pandemic, World Table Tennis has been working to better understand and have a better understanding of its own valuation of the business itself. There has been one case study I'll share on the following slide as well, which gives quite good optimistic approach for us to hopefully see an even greater valuation for table tennis as a whole. However, with the overall pandemic wreaking havoc on international sport, it was quite interesting to see that the positive news or the positive reviews that has come from the initial introduction of World Table Tennis, which has allowed us to lay the foundation for future growth. External investment will be necessary to be able to achieve the objectives, and further discussions will happen in the coming months with a number of different potential external investors, of which some conversations have already started to commence. When looking at one of the case studies, we look at Volleyball World, or the FIVB, the International Federation for Volleyball. They were actually quite successful in securing external investment at the beginning of this year. It was confirmed, I believe it was in February or March. However, there was quite positive reports even coming from the IOC president in regards to the launch of Volleyball World. Your new commercial initiative is only the most recent example of how the FIVB is seizing opportunities. At the same time, you retain your role as regulator of your sport and its values. This is extremely important, not only for you, but for the entire Olympic movement. So we can see quite positive reports coming from the IOC as well in regards to seeking external investment as an international federation. When looking at media reports or news reports, Volleyball World has been reported to have received over $100 million in investment, which has therefore placed their organization or their commercial entity with a valuation of greater than $300 million. So this is again a benchmark where we can look to compare to other international federations. And for example, I think most of the people on this call would like to assume that table tennis is even bigger and greater than volleyball. So if that's the case, then we could be expecting figures even larger than those amounts mentioned there. The investor that did invest this amount was CVC, a private equity fund, and they're one of the potential investors that World Table Tennis would look to have discussions with as well, to see how we can look to build the events for players and fans, looking at host city experiences, how to enhance ticketing and hospitality revenues. So a lot of ways in which we can improve the overall image of table tennis. Risk assessment. So as mentioned before, an important element of the external investment is also on the risk side. As part of the ITTF constitution, there will be a new ITTF Finance and Audit Committee appointed at the upcoming Board of Directors meeting, in which an initial task should be for a risk assessment workshop to be undertaken, which is also important in line with the refreshed ITTF strategic plan. It's important to understand what the strategic plan is before you can understand what the risks may be. So therefore, these two do go hand in hand, and it is important for the risk assessment to take place to help safeguard the ITTF. To go into a bit more detail on the Olympic Games revenue share. So I have mentioned this throughout the evening or throughout the presentation today, because it is quite a unique topic. And there are, I would say, a number of different comments or rumors that seem to be floated around in regards to why do we receive this money? What do we receive it for? How should we spend it? How should we not spend it? And so on. In simple or in summary, the revenue share coming from the Olympic Games is a lump sum shared to the ITTF following table tennis's involvement in the Olympic Games. There are no, let's say, contracts or rules or requirements of how the funding must be spent. Essentially, ITTF receives a 1 or 2 page letter from the IOC confirming this is the amount of funding that will be received. And then fortunately for ITTF, we generally receive those funds within 6 to 9 months of the conclusion of the Olympic Games. However, as part of the ongoing pandemic, one thing that has been a little bit different this Olympic cycle is generally we would receive confirmation of the amount of funding to be received in advance. We would generally receive it 1 or 2 years prior to the Olympic Games. And I believe it was in 2019 at the AGM General Assembly, the Association of Summer Olympic International Federations, where the distribution of this revenue share was confirmed. The amount that was shared there was greater than the amount we had received following Rio 2016. However, with the ongoing pandemic and the additional costs the IOC incurred to ensure the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games went ahead, we did take a prudent approach, assuming that the total amount to be received is likely to be less. As part of the communication we did receive from the IOC about a month ago, they did mention how they will be working hard to try to at least reach the same level as what was received following Rio 2016 Olympic Games, which would be roughly $2 million less than what was expected to be received pre-COVID. However, we also need to consider how that will be managed in terms of the strategy, in terms of how we look to allocate those funds. And as mentioned, it generally goes towards governance, development, administration, integrity, member relations support, and so on. For better use of the term, those areas of the organization that don't necessarily generate their own large amounts of revenue. However, they are vital and important to not just the growth and development of table tennis, but the operations and the management of keeping ITTF as an organization as professional as possible. But one other measure that should be considered too, from a prudent aspect, is although we have received communication that we should receive an amount similar to that following Rio 2016, it was announced a couple of weeks ago at the ANOC General Assembly that their budget or their finances due to be received from the IOC will be reduced by 70%. So therefore, we must remain prudent, and we need to understand. We need to be flexible and agile, which has been a couple words used throughout the presentation as well. But we need to understand how we can manage those adjustments that may come in. And that's hopefully not finishing on a somber note. Hopefully it does mean that we will have a full amount of Olympic funds received, and then we can guarantee our operations. But also it does link to the external investment and the ability to de-risk or to not place too much reliance on one single source of income. So that's a conclusion in regards to the overall presentation. I will pass back to, I will also start to now go through any further questions that may have been raised during the second part of the presentation in relation to the future, more so than what's only taken place in the past. And sorry, I'm just double checking my notes as well. So yes, so there was one question in relation to, so two questions, I believe, coming from the Mr. Leviton, the European Table Tennis Union president. One question, where in expenses section is the money for continental federations, and what is the amount? The way in which we present our financial statements is presented based on the activities of ITTF, not based on the activities of our continental federations. Therefore, it does get divided across the different areas. For example, competitions, high performance and development, member relations, all of the different areas where the continental federations benefit from the ITTF. So we don't put a specific lump sum because we're not presenting our financial statements for our continental federations. We present our financial statements for our member associations. And then a second question was, what will be the procedure of allocating money for member associations? Another very good question, and this is something we are looking to further enhance or further evolve in the overall, let's say, evolution of ITTF as a whole. When we first started providing support for continental federations, it made sense to start small in a way, as in what's a smaller group of organizations we can support. And obviously with the continental federations, we get a global spread of support where table tennis can be grown around the world. As ITTF grows as a whole, in more recent years, we've started to also work where possible with some regional associations. So for example, one of the more prominent examples would be within Africa, where Africa has 5 separate regions. They have a North Africa region, a West Africa region, a East Africa region, Central Africa, as well as Southern Africa, where ITTF has looked to provide further, more direct support into those 5 different regions. And ideally, moving forward in the future, we would like to have the direct support where we can provide direct support to all 226 members of the ITTF. Obviously, in a way similar to how FIFA has managed, where they have direct support to all of their members, or a couple of the other international federations. Obviously, the dollar amounts may not be as at the same level as FIFA, for example, but it is important to ensure we do have that direct relation with our member associations. And as for how we would allocate the amount of funding being allocated towards each of the member associations, again, that falls in line with the overall strategy of ITTF. So it may be funding allocated towards events, it may be funding allocated towards development, it may be funding allocated towards governance support. And then obviously the total dollar amount would be dependent upon the total budget. And then again, the total budget is dependent upon how many events can take place, how much revenue can be generated, how much potential external investment can be generated as well. Because obviously the more funds that are made available, the greater the investment can be. However, something we may look at implementing in the future would be to have an amount of a percentage amount of revenue being specifically allocated. But as mentioned earlier, an overall example of, say, continental federation funding in a 4-year period for 2017 to 2020 was in excess of over $10 million US. So if we looked at that based on the total revenue, we're talking around 15% of total revenue that has been allocated. So that's a summary of the questions I've received so far. I would like to pass back to Petra for if she has any further remarks or comments.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you everyone for all the interactions in the Q&A. And due to the questions coming up during the Q&A, we will provide the continents report on how much we spent on our affiliated continents and our member associations over the 4 years. I like now to continue with the final words, and in the final words, I first of all like to thank our Finance and Audit Committee. Mr. Solanellas, Mr. Chodary, Mr. Bohomsky, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to work with you, and I'm sure that we will work together also in the future to come. I also, of course, like to take the opportunity to thank my CFO, Michael Brown, for the hard work during this unpredictable time, but also, of course, our CEO, who led our financial during this period of time in a very sustainable way. Thank you so much, and do look forward to the future to come. Thank you for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. And that brings a conclusion to our finance forum. I know we did have a number of questions, and we will look for further opportunities for dialogue in the lead up to the AGM itself. And obviously during the AGM will be the presentation of the finances as part of the formality of the ITTF AGM, where the finances will be put forward for approval by the membership. So that wraps or brings a conclusion to our finance forum for today. As mentioned at the beginning, there are still 3 more video conferences in the lead up to the ITTF AGM, with the next one taking place next Monday. So thanks again, everyone, for your participation and your involvement in today's forum. I hope it was insightful for people to get a better understanding of how ITTF manages its overall finances, as well as a little bit of a glimpse into the hopefully optimistic future where we do see a return to the table for people around the world, as well as growth for us, our sport of table tennis. So thanks one more time from myself, and thanks again to all of the staff involved for our ITTF finance team, as well as Petra mentioned with our finance and audit committee as well. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing everyone in Houston in a couple of weeks' time for those who are able to travel during the pandemic period. Thanks a lot, and bye.